When you picture 19th century Paris, what comes to mind? Probably gaslights, glittering ballrooms, romance, right? Well, beneath all that sparkle, another city was festering in the dark. A world of shadows and desperation. A world that high society did its best to ignore. But one author, Eugène Sue, decided to drag it kicking and screaming into the light with his absolutely revolutionary novel, The Mysteries of Paris. So today, let's take a deep breath and descend into the dark, fascinating world that he uncovered.
You see, Sue wasn't just writing some cheap thriller for entertainment. Oh no. He saw himself as a kind of social surgeon, performing an autopsy on a city that was gorgeous on the outside, but deeply diseased on the inside. He was convinced that crime wasn't some inherent evil people were born with, but a symptom of a sick society. These moral sewers, as he called them, were a direct result of poverty and neglect, and he was going to make sure his readers saw it, whether they liked it or not.
And in the Paris of the 1840s, those secrets had a name: the criminal underworld. This was a whole parallel society. It had its own language, its own twisted code of honor, its own brutal logic. Sue didn't just write about it. He basically took his readers by the hand and led them right down into the abyss. And our descent? It starts right now.
Okay, so our first stop is the beating, corrupted heart of this underworld, the Tapis Franc. Now this wasn't just a tavern or a bar. You need to think of it more like an embassy for the damned, a place where all the rules of the world above just stopped. In Sue's novel, the setting itself is a predator. It's alive, it's breathing, and it is just waiting to swallow you whole.
So what exactly was a tapis franc? Well, it was the central nervous system of criminal Paris. It was a recruiting office, a black market, a courtroom, and a hideout, all rolled into one squalid, incredibly dangerous package. This is where deals were struck in hushed tones, where plots were hatched over watered-down wine, and where a human life could be valued in just a few coins.
And listen to how Sue brings this place to life. This quote just captures that raw, frantic energy. He's painting a picture not just of crime, but of this desperate, frenzied escape from reality. This dance, La Chahoot, which was kind of like an early, much wilder can-can, it wasn't about joy. It was an explosion of defiance, a chaotic release in a world where you were never guaranteed to see tomorrow. You can almost feel the floors shaking, smell the cheap wine, and hear the manic laughter just before it turns into something much, much darker.
All right, so we've seen these core places, but what about the people who called them home? The figures who emerged from the chaos of the Tapis Franc are more than just simple monsters. And this is where Sue's genius really shines. He shows us that the folks living in this abyss were complex, often tragic figures. Each one had a story that explained how they fell so far. He was way more interested in the why of their crimes than just the what.
And this comparison just captures his nuanced perspective perfectly. On one side, you have a guy like Pic Vinaigre. He was pushed into theft by circumstance, by poverty. He's not proud of it. He even calls himself a coward. He's just trying to survive and help his family. But then you have Nicolas Martial. He embraces his criminal legacy. For him, crime is a birthright, a dynasty. He inherits infamy the same way a duke inherits a title. So Sue is asking us, are these two men really equally guilty?
And there it is. That's the worldview forged in the fires of the underworld. It's such a profoundly cynical statement. If the world outside has its hierarchy of lords and aristocrats, then fine, this world will have its own. Infamy becomes fame. Notoriety becomes nobility. It's this bitter, defiant pride that turns society's condemnation into a badge of honor.
So where does society put men like Pic Vinaigre and Nicolas Martial? Well, they end up inside the walls of La Force prison. But this is where Sue raises a really disturbing question. Was this place actually a place of reform, or was it more like a state-sponsored university for crime, a place that took bad men and made them experts?
Now, this is one of Sue's most brilliant moves. He sets you up to expect a filthy medieval dungeon. You're picturing rats and damp stones. But instead, he describes a place that's surprisingly clean, almost comfortable. The physical conditions are actually better than what many poor, honest workers had on the outside. It's a shocking, deliberate contrast, and it's designed to make you really uncomfortable.
With this one statement, Sue just forces us to look past the surface. He's basically saying the real filth isn't on the floors, it's baked into the system itself. The problem isn't a lack of sanitation, it's a profound lack of humanity. The prison might be physically clean, but morally, it's a plague pit.
And this is what he meant by a moral pestilence. By throwing everyone together, the petty thief, the first-time offender, the hardened murderer, the prison was creating a contagion, Any little spark of remorse you might have had was immediately extinguished by mockery. Any hesitation was seen as weakness. It became a breeding ground where veteran criminals taught their trade to the newcomers, and the only way to survive was to become even more brutal than the guy next to you.
We can see this tragic process of corruption play out perfectly through a character named Francois Germain. So a man comes in feeling guilty, right? But then he's surrounded by men who laugh about murder. Suddenly, his own crime starts to feel, well, trivial. He sees their swagger, the status they have within the prison walls, and pretty soon envy starts to replace remorse. His conscience doesn't just fade away, it is actively murdered by the environment. The prison system isn't curing the disease, it's incubating it.
And so for Sue, the prison wasn't just a failed institution. Ultimately, it was a perfect metaphor for the sickness that was coursing through all of French society, a sickness of hypocrisy, of inequality, and of profound injustice.
And if you want proof, this slide just lays the system's hypocrisy bare. It's just staggering. Pique Vinegre, who stole out of desperation to feed his family, is looking at decades of hard labor. But Maitre Boulard, a wealthy official who commits a calculated breach of trust, gets a measly 2 months. For Sue, this was the ultimate proof that the law wasn't some blind scale of justice. It was a weapon used by the rich to control the poor.
So this is the core of his entire argument. Society manufactures criminals. It creates slums, it denies people an education, it pays starvation wages, and then it has the nerve to act shocked when people living in these moral sewers break the law just to survive. It's punishing the symptoms while completely ignoring the disease. And with this simple, devastating question, Sue essentially throws the challenge right back at his readers. He's presented all the evidence. He's taken us through the filth of the tapis franc and the moral decay of the prison. He's shown us the injustice. Now, he asks, what are you going to do about it? And believe me, that's a question that echoed all the way through the halls of power in 19th century France. Which brings us to the central, burning question of Sue's masterpiece. Is crime some kind of accidental choice that must be punished? Or is it a sickness born of circumstance that could and maybe should be cured? It's a question that was absolutely radical in the 1840s, and honestly, it's one we are still wrestling with today. What do you think?